Welcome to the deep dive. We're jumping straight into a pretty significant Supreme Court case today. Arguments were just heard this week, May 15th.
That's right. It all stems from that executive order back in January 2025 from former President Trump focusing on birthright citizenship.
Birthright citizenship. Okay.
Hi.
And the order basically tried to, what? Change who gets automatic citizenship.
Exactly. It aimed to deny automatic U.S. citizenship to children born here on U.S. soil if their parents are undocumented or maybe here on like temporary visas. It's a big challenge to the 14th Amendment as we've known it.
So this fundamental idea, born here, you're a citizen, that's being directly questioned. But wait, you said there's more to it. The court wasn't just looking at that part.
Correct. That's the headline issue, sure. But beneath that, the justices are really digging into something else. Whether federal courts, like district courts, actually have the power to issue these things called nationwide injunctions.
Nationwide injunctions. Refresh my memory. Those are the court orders that can stop a federal policy everywhere, right? Across the whole country.
Precisely. So if a lower court thinks this birthright order might be unconstitutional, a nationwide injunction could, pause it for everyone, not just in the state where the lawsuit was filed.
Gotcha. And you're saying this part, the injunction part, connects to other things.
Yes, and this is where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit unexpected. How the court rules on these injunctions and even how they talk about the 14th Amendment in this context could have some serious knock-on effects for other civil rights, specifically transgender rights.
Transgender rights. Okay, that feels like quite a jump. How does a case about birthright citizenship link up with that?
Well, it's about the legal plumbing, if you will, the tools and the constitutional arguments. Federal courts have actually used nationwide injunctions quite a bit to block policies targeting transgender people.
Ah, okay.
Policies seen as discriminatory. And on top of that, many legal arguments defending trans rights rely heavily on the 14th Amendment, the very same amendment that's central to this birthright citizenship fight.
So what we're diving into today, using reports from places like AP News, NPR, Time, KBIA, The Guardian, and others, it's this idea that a case about who gets citizenship at birth could actually reshape how courts protect all sorts of marginalized groups.
That's the core of it. Yeah. So maybe we should start with the foundation, the whole birthright citizenship principle itself.
Good idea. The 14th Amendment. It's got that key line, right? All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens.
Of the United States, yes. And for, over a century now, that's been taken to mean pretty much everyone born on U.S. soil gets citizenship automatically.
The cornerstone, really.
Absolutely. But this executive order from January tried to essentially rewrite that understanding, or at least interpret it very differently, to exclude kids whose parents aren't citizens or permanent residents.
And that didn't just slide by. I remember a bunch of states pushed back.
Oh, yeah. 22 states, actually, led by New Jersey's Solicitor General, Jeremy Feigenbaum. They sued to block the order.
But, and this is the interesting part you mentioned earlier, when it got to the Supreme Court this week, they weren't laser focused on whether the order itself was constitutional.
Not primarily, no. The arguments really seem to pivot heavily onto this question of the power of the courts to issue these nationwide injunctions. That seemed to be the main event, for now at least.
Okay, let's unpack these nationwide injunctions then. Why are they so important or controversial in this case?
So a nationwide injunction, basically, it's a temporary halt. A court says, okay, this federal law or action, stop enforcing it anywhere in the country while we figure out if it's legal.
Right.
The rationale is often to avoid chaos. You don't want a situation where a federal rule applies in Texas, but not in California, but then it does in Florida.
Yeah.
It gets messy and seems unfair.
Yeah, that sounds like a nightmare. Rights turning on and off at state lines. And Feigenbaum, the lawyer for the states, he argued they're necessary sometimes.
He argued strongly for that. He said, look, in certain, specific situations that affect millions of people all at once, like this potential citizenship change, a nationwide block is really the only effective tool.
Okay. And connecting that back now, you said these injunctions have been used to protect transgender rights?
They have. It's a key legal strategy that's been employed.
Any examples come to mind?
Sure. Think back to 2017. The Trump administration tried to ban transgender people from serving in the military. Several federal courts issued nationwide injunctions that significantly delayed and complicated that ban's implementation.
I remember that, yeah.
And more recently, we've seen courts use them to block some state laws banning gender-affirming care for trans youth. Those injunctions stopped the bans from taking effect statewide, sometimes nationwide if it was a federal policy issue, while the legal challenges proceeded.
So the potential risk here, if the Supreme Court says, whoa, hold on, federal courts can't issue these nationwide injunctions or maybe severely limits them, what happens then?
Well, the big concern is it weakens a major tool for protecting vulnerable groups, including trans people. Without that quick, broad stopgap, laws seen as harmful or discriminatory could take effect state by state much faster.
Creating that patchwork you mentioned.
Exactly, causing real harm before courts maybe get a chance to rule on the merits in potentially dozens of separate cases. It slows down the protection.
And this all loops back to the 14th Amendment again. It's not just the Citizenship Clause we started with.
Not at all. The 14th Amendment is huge. Ratified in 1868, its main goal was citizenship and equal protection for formerly enslaved people. But those clauses, due process of law and equal protection of the laws, they become foundational for so many civil rights struggles.
And that includes transgender rights.
Absolutely. Those
Yep.
clauses are central. When you see lawsuits challenging discrimination against trans people, whether it's about healthcare access, school policies, employment, they're very often arguing that the discrimination violates the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection or due process.
Can you give a specific case example, maybe?
Sure. The Gavin Grimm case is a well-known one. That was about a transgender boy fighting for access to the boys' restroom at his school. His legal team relied heavily on Title IX's, but also on the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause.
Okay.
And similarly, when courts have blocked state bans on gender-affirming care for minors, they often cite the 14th Amendment, arguing these bans discriminate based on sex or transgender status, denying equal protection.
So the potential danger is if the Supreme Court, in this birthright citizenship case, interprets the 14th Amendment's protections narrowly, say, regarding who is subject to the jurisdiction, could that bleed over?
That's the fear. A narrow interpretation in one context could set a precedent. The legal reasoning used to limit rights for one group relying on the 14th Amendment could potentially be applied to other groups relying on those same protections. It's this idea of a domino effect.
Right. Restrict the scope here, and it might logically lead to restrictions elsewhere using the same logic.
Precisely. It narrows the understanding of who the amendment protects and how.
It feels like this case taps into something much bigger than just the legal text. There's a whole political and cultural context here, isn't there?
Absolutely. You really have to see it as part of a broader struggle over who essentially counts as fully American, who belongs, who gets full protection and recognition.
And you're suggesting the fight over birthright citizenship runs parallel to efforts to restrict transgender rights.
I think there's a clear parallel, yeah. You see challenges to the established understanding of birthright citizenship alongside this wave of state legislation targeting trans people in healthcare and sports, bathrooms, schools. There seems to be an underlying theme in some political movements suggesting that certain groups are somehow less entitled to full participation or protection in society.
And the courts become the battlefield for these competing visions.
Very much so. How the Supreme Court rules on the tools like injunctions and the substance like the 13th Amendment scope will really shape how effectively these kinds of exclusionary policy goals can be advanced or blocked.
Let's drill down into the practical side for transgender people. If this case goes a certain way, what are the real-world impacts we might see?
Well, several things. First, remember many trans people are immigrants or come from immigrant families. So if birthright citizenship gets limited, imagine a child born in the U.S. to undocumented trans parents. That child could be rendered stateless.
Stateless. Wow, no country recognizes them as a citizen.
A terrifying prospect. It could also create huge hurdles for trans parents trying to secure basic rights and health care for their U.S.-born children.
And the injunction piece, if those are restricted.
Then, as we discussed, anti-trans laws could spread much more easily. Fewer roadblocks. So you could potentially see more bans on gender-affirming care actually taking effect, more discrimination in schools or jobs going unchecked for longer, more threats to basic safety and dignity.
It really highlights how interconnected these legal tools and constitutional interpretations are. A decision here directly impacts the fight there.
Deeply interconnected.
Okay, so let's talk about the actual arguments at the Supreme Court on May 15th. What was the vibe? What were the justices focused on?
The main focus, as we've said, really seemed to be the power of federal courts to issue these nationwide injunctions. And the justices, they sounded pretty divided.
The liberal justices seemed more supportive of the lower courts blocking the order.
Generally, yes. Justice Kagan, for example, sounded quite skeptical of the administration's argument against the nationwide injunction. She pointed out the practical problems of only blocking the order in certain states and noted the long history of how birthright citizenship has been understood. She also mentioned quite pointedly that every court to look at this had ruled against the government.
And the conservative justices, what were their main points?
Skepticism about the injunctions was definitely prominent there. Justice Alito questioned whether district judges were acting like, I think his term was, monarchs by issuing orders with such broad reach.
Monarchs. Strong language.
Yeah. And Justice Thomas seemed to view these nationwide injunctions as a relatively new thing, historically speaking, suggesting the country got along fine without them for a long time. Though it's worth noting, legal historians debate how new they really are, given the changing nature of federal law.
Right, the context changes. Did anyone propose alternatives? I thought I read Justice Kavanaugh suggested something.
He did. He floated the idea of using class action lawsuits instead. Could that provide broad relief without needing a nationwide injunction?
But that got pushed back too. Concerns were raised about whether class actions are always practical or fast enough, and if the government could still bog them down.
And Justice Sotomayor, what were her concerns?
She really hammered on the practical chaos, the confusing patchwork of rules argument. And she brought up the very serious risk of children ending up stateless if citizenship was denied here and they had no claim elsewhere.
So you had Feigenbaum for the states arguing it's unworkable without nationwide injunctions in cases like this, right? Arguing citizenship could turn on and off across state lines. He stressed they're needed in narrow, specific circumstances.
And the administration's lawyer, Solicitor General Sauer, arguing they're, what was his phrase, a nuclear weapon.
A nuclear weapon against executive power, yeah. And that they lack historical backing. So very different views on the role and legitimacy of these injunctions.
Okay, so the arguments have happened. What's next? When do we expect a decision?
The usual timeline is before the court breaks for its summer recess. So likely sometime before the end of June, maybe early July 2025.
And just to reiterate, the impact of this decision, it's going to be pretty significant, isn't it, for the power of courts, for civil rights?
Oh, absolutely. It's going to shape how rights are protected or not protected by the federal courts for potentially a very long time.
So wrapping up this deep dive, we started with a case about birthright citizenship, triggered by that 2025 executive order. But as we've explored looking at the May 15th arguments, the real crux, at least for now, seems to be these nationwide injunctions.
Right. And the unexpected but crucial link to transgender rights emerges through those injunctions as a legal tool and through the shared reliance on the 14th Amendment.
How the court interprets both that tool and that amendment in this context could echo far beyond immigration law. It shows how these legal tools, like injunctions, debated in one area, are vital in others, too.
Exactly. The principles aren't isolated. The arguments and precedents set here could influence legal battles across the civil rights spectrum.
So the thought to leave you with as you follow this case is just how interconnected these legal battles can be. A decision that seems specific on the surface can ripple outwards in really significant ways. The outcome here will tell us a lot about this court's view on judicial power and constitutional rights for everyone.
That's right. It really prompts you to think about how protecting rights for one group often relies on legal principles that protect others too, and vice versa.
Definitely something to keep an eye on. If you want to dig deeper, keep track of the Supreme Court's decision when it lands, and maybe look into organizations working on the front lines of both immigrant rights and transgender rights. They'll certainly be analyzing the impact.